They may not have Kyle McCord next season, but Syracuse's quarterback room should still be just fine.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Of course, we're always free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we're going to discuss the strengths of Syracuse football. The starting safeties for the Orange, Duce, Chestnut, and Devin Grant are back for 2025. We'll talk about how the wide receiver room looks different, but it should still be strong this upcoming season. And we're going to start the podcast talking about Syracuse's quarterback room, which, despite not having Kyle McCord, I think that they're going to be okay with either Steve Angeli or Rickie Collins this upcoming season. All that and more here on today's edition of Locked On Syracuse. And before we get to everything, this episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. So first of all, shout out to Syracuse men's lacrosse. They play Maryland today in the Final Four for the first time in over a decade. They are actually here on Memorial Day weekend. They have their game at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. I am recording this before the game, so hopefully by the time you are watching or listening to this podcast, we know the result, and Syracuse lacrosse ended up winning. And if they do win, they will play Cornell on Monday for the national championship. Now let's discuss Syracuse football, all right? Now, like basketball, they still have a couple of open scholarships remaining. 24/7 Sports insider Mike McAllister pointed that out in his Syracuse football scholarship tracker. They have 103 of a possible 105 scholarships allowed. Will Syracuse use them? I guess time will tell. I know that's cliche, but that's the reality. But it could be a relatively significant addition if Syracuse does decide to add to its team, right? Because exactly 1 year ago from today, here on May 24th, Syracuse actually added Will Nixon, the running back from the transfer portal, who was the primary backup to LaQuinn Allen as a pass catcher before suffering a season-ending injury to his foot. But let's get to Syracuse's quarterback room, because I'm confident that Syracuse's quarterback room is not going to change between now and the start of the season in late August against Tennessee. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I do want to be clear. I don't think that Steve Angeli or Rickie Collins are an improvement on Kyle McCord. I don't think either are coming here and are going to literally set single season ACC records. I just don't see that happening. Sorry, maybe you can call me a negative Nancy, but expecting one of these guys to throw for over 4,500 yards and set ACC records, I don't think is necessarily realistic. But if we're being honest, there's literally nobody that Syracuse could have added in the transfer portal on the level of Kyle McCord this season. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. Maybe John Mateer at Oklahoma wins the Heisman Trophy, or maybe there's someone under the radar, takes another step. Who knows? But looking at the list of quarterback transfers, there was nobody on the level of Kyle McCord this season. When you look at the competition, right, we're really going to only focus on the competition here in this segment, because over the summer, when we get into positional previews, we'll talk about each and every one of the quarterbacks more at length. But we're just going to talk about the two main guys right now. Notre Dame's Steve Angeli and LSU's Rickie Collins, okay? I think no matter what, no matter who the starter is, Syracuse is going to be in relatively good hands. Rickie Collins, he signed with Syracuse in December, only 7 career passing attempts. Steve Angeli, he signed with Syracuse in April. He's got a little bit more experience with 80 career passing attempts, and we'll get to it in just a second. He was really good in those 80 career passing attempts. But there is inexperience in that room with Rickie Collins and Steve Angeli. But I have a little bit of confidence, and I'll tell you why. There are two scenarios here. Number one, Rickie Collins beats out Steve Angeli for the starting quarterback job. If this happens, Rickie Collins wins the job over Steve Angeli, and why quarterback room seems to be a strength for Syracuse this upcoming season, I think we have to have pretty good faith that Rickie Collins is going to end up being pretty good for Syracuse. Because Steve Angeli transferred from Notre Dame in the spring portal window, and he did not come to Syracuse to hold a clipboard, to be the backup quarterback. He's coming to Syracuse, and he's at least going to compete for the starting quarterback job. And Steve Angeli, furthermore, he had a legitimate chance to be Notre Dame's starting quarterback. And you don't get that opportunity by accident. If Notre Dame is saying, hey, we think you might have a chance to be able to start here, that means the kid has some talent. And that's ultimately why I believe when he did not win the job, he decided to transfer in the spring rather than transferring in December, because he could have transferred in December. But Notre Dame saw something in him which said, hey, maybe he can be the starting quarterback. So if Rickie Collins wins the job anyway, I think that really speaks a lot to Rickie Collins' ability. Hey, maybe this guy's just really damn good, right? And then there's the flip side, which is that Steve Angeli wins the starting job. And I think that's the more realistic scenario here. I think that's more likely to happen. I'm confident that he can be a starting quarterback in the ACC. Again, competing for Notre Dame's starting quarterback job. And his numbers are outstanding, albeit very limited, right? 80 career passing attempts, but 10-1 touchdown to interception ratio. That's pretty good. Over 70% completion rate and over 11 yards per attempt. So even though it's a very limited sample, he was really good in that sample. And maybe I'm delusional, but I think he could be a solid starting quarterback in the ACC. Maybe not on the level of Kyle McCord, right? I'm not predicting that Steve Angeli is going to be second team all ACC, but could he be pretty good? Could he hold down the fort? I believe so, if he is named the starting quarterback for Syracuse. I should also mention that football recruiting expert Brian Smith, he's pointed out concerns about this, and I think they're very valid concerns, which is that Steve Angeli committed in April as opposed to December. And what this means is that Steve Angeli had no time over the course of spring practice to learn the system or build chemistry with his wide receivers. We'll actually talk about Johntay Cook in the next segment when we're discussing the wide receiver room. Johntay Cook is also a spring portal addition, and he might be the team's #1 wide receiver. So you have one of your top receivers and potentially your starting quarterback as spring portal additions. So it'll be very interesting to see how the two build chemistry and learn Jeff Nixon's offense. I think it is a valid concern, but I guess time will tell, right? I understand that it's cliche, but we won't find out until the season actually starts how well those guys were able to adjust. But overall, I think no matter what, Syracuse football is going to get good quarterback play next season. And that's a really good thing. If they get good quarterback play, I can't promise you that they are going to be a good team. But I can promise you they'll at least be fun, right? I know you may not want to hear it, but you get the point. You can have a really good quarterback, but if the rest of your roster stinks and your schedule is really difficult, you could still lose. But obviously, if you have a really bad quarterback, well, you're probably going to lose anyway. And I'm not saying that Syracuse is going to lose, but I do think they will get good quarterback play. And ultimately, that's why I believe that they are at least, even with a daunting schedule, going to make a bowl this upcoming season. And again, I also should point this out. I mentioned this earlier on here in the podcast, maybe a minute or two ago, but they got the coaching staff back. Offensive coordinator Jeff Nixon is back for another season. So we'll see if he can work wonders on Syracuse's quarterback like he did last year with Kyle McCord. Right? Comment your thoughts in the comments section below if you believe or you don't believe that Syracuse's or one of Syracuse football's strengths is their quarterback room. And who do you believe is going to be the Syracuse starting quarterback week 1 against Tennessee? Now, coming up, obviously, quarterbacks, they need guys to throw to, and it appears like Syracuse football has a very steady group of wide receivers, and we'll talk about them next here on Locked On Syracuse. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and you start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. This is Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and let's get back to talking about Syracuse football's strengths for this upcoming 2025 season, which is less than 100 days from now. Week 1 kickoff in late August against Tennessee. Noon Eastern kickoff, by the way. Let's get to the wide receivers, which I know you may not want to hear this, okay? But just imagine if Syracuse had this same wide receiver room right now, but Trevor Pena was there. I know you didn't want to hear it. I understand that. But just imagine. He's gone. He's with Penn State now. Good luck to him. That being said, the wide receiver room for Syracuse is still a strength. I still think it's pretty good. Now, I'd love to hear from you right now. I mean, how do you feel about it? The wide receiver room? Because I think it looks pretty good still. I think Syracuse recovered okay after the loss of Trevor Pena. Let's discuss the top wide receivers for just a second here. The two top guys, it appears on paper. Keep in mind that things can change. Keep in mind that one of the guys we're going to mention here, it might take time for him to really carve out a role. But as of right now on paper, the two top guys appear to be Washington/Texas transfer Johntay Cook, who is an electric talent, high upside guy, former 5-star in 2023. Hasn't quite worked out for him yet, and really, it's his last chance with Syracuse football. So hopefully they can get the most out of him, but we do know that there's talent there. The other guy is Darrell Gill, who was Syracuse's 5th option on the offense last year. I wouldn't say he was the 5th wide receiver, but he was the 5th passing option a year ago. You had 4 guys clearly ahead of him. Arondé Gadsden, LaQuinn Allen, Jackson Meeks, Trevor Pena. All those guys got more targets, more looks, more receptions, yards, whatever, right? But yet, I don't say that in a way to demean Darrell Gill that he was the 5th option last year, because think of it this way. He was the 5th option, yet he still carved out a role. He got over 570 yards a year ago, and he led the ACC with 18 yards a catch. He seems like a guy that's ready for an increased role this upcoming season. Now, maybe you feel differently. Maybe you agree with me, so feel free to chime in the comment section below right now. But I like Darrell Gill this upcoming season. So Syracuse has Johntay Cook, who's got a ton of talent, and you also have Darrell Gill, who seems like he's ready for that 3rd-year true breakout. Darrell Gill averaged 18 yards a catch, which led the ACC, and Johntay Cook, what's the number one thing that we really know about him as far as his ability? It's his speed. So Syracuse has not one but 2 guys, and they're their top 2 receivers that can stretch the field. That's massive for any offense to have that type of speed. Then you have some veterans here. Amari Hatcher and Justice Ross Simmons, who I think provide a decent floor of production for Syracuse this upcoming year. They didn't really wow last season. I mean, they combined for about 500 yards, as depth options, but they're pretty good depth when you look more in depth at Amari Hatcher and Justice Ross Simmons. Hatcher had over 480 yards in a more increased role in 2023, and Justice Ross Simmons had over 700 yards with Colorado State in 2023. Those were just depth guys a year ago. They might just be depth again for this upcoming season, but they do provide nice, decent floor for Syracuse wide receiver production. And then he got a lot of guys with upside. There's 2024 four-star wide receiver Emmanuel Ross. Didn't see a lot of playing time a year ago. Maybe he gets an increased role this upcoming season. You got South Carolina transfer Tyshawn Russell, who I wasn't really high on at the time when they got him in the transfer portal. They got him in December. But Fran Brown has praised him a number of times this offseason. So we'll see. Maybe he's the next Jackson Meeks. He transfers from an SEC school, and while he was at that SEC school, he didn't really do a whole lot, but he comes to Syracuse, gets an opportunity, and he thrives, right? Jackson Meeks, he didn't really do much at Georgia when he was there. Comes to Syracuse, wasn't even a starting wide receiver right away, but when he got his chance, he had over 1,000 yards and got second team All ACC, and now is at an NFL training camp, which I did not think would happen a year ago from this moment. So who knows? Maybe that could be a guy like Tyshawn Russell, right? Then you got some redshirt freshmen, Jalen Hornsby, Teron Hale. Maybe they see some action, or maybe a guy like true freshman in Darius Boobie Johnson, who impressed at the spring game. Is it realistic that those guys that I mentioned, that all of them are going to break out, or multiple of those guys are going to break out in 2025? No. But the way you got to look at it is this. All you need is one. That's it. All you really need is one guy to break out, if that. Because you got Darrell Gill. You have a couple of decent veterans in Amari Hatcher and Justice Ross Simmons. And then you probably need one more guy to break out, but that could include Johntay Cook. So when I look at the wide receiver room, am I going to sit here and say it's better on paper than what they had a year ago when their two top guys were All ACC and Jackson Meeks and Trevor Pena? No, not necessarily. But I do think this is a very good mix of, hey, we got some guys with upside, we got some guys with a decent floor of production, and we also have some breakout candidates. I'd love to hear from you right now in the comments section below, but the more I look at the wide receiver room for Syracuse, the more I talk myself into, hey, I think this is a really strong unit this upcoming season. Comment your thoughts in the comments section below. Now, coming up, we'll talk about how Syracuse has their two starting safeties back. That should help the defense, and that's coming up next on Locked On Syracuse. Two of Syracuse's starting safeties a year ago are back for this upcoming season. Elijah Clark, he's in the NFL now. But the good news is that Duce Chestnut and Devin Grant returned to Syracuse football. And anytime, especially in this day and age with the transfer portal, you can get starting players to return to your team doing similar roles. That is a good thing. Let's talk about the production that Duce Chestnut and Devin Grant had combined a year ago. 118 tackles, 12 tackles for loss, 4 forced fumbles, one of which by Devin Grant came in the third quarter of the Miami game, where Xavier Restrepo got a first down. It was a tie game, I believe, at 28. Devin Grant forced the fumble, recovered the fumble, and then he returned it to the house. And if I remember correctly, Devin Grant was given ACC Player of the Week or ACC Defensive Player of the Week for his performance against Miami, but he was a big part in that upset win and that comeback win against the Miami Hurricanes, the final regular season game of the season. The duo of Devin Grant and Duce Chestnut also combined for 2 interceptions, which when you look at, that might be the one thing or one area where you're saying, I'd like a little bit more production there. I'd like a little bit more takeaways from Duce Chestnut and Devin Grant. But overall, They're solid. Were either of them all ACC last season? No, but they actually have a history of being all conference. Devin Grant was all MAC when he was at Buffalo, and Duce Chestnut, we'll get to in a moment here, he was actually all ACC for Syracuse for a couple of years when he started his career, then went to LSU, then came back to Syracuse. So they both have a history of being all conference. They were an all conference last season, but they are still a very capable duo. Another reason why it's a strength for Syracuse getting Duce Chestnut and Devin Grant back for this upcoming season is the position flexibility that they provide. They can play safety or they can play corner. Duce used to be a corner, and he was all conference, like I mentioned, for Syracuse in 2021 and in 2022. And Devin Grant a year ago, he actually began the season as a corner before eventually shifting around when Syracuse made all their changes to their defensive lineup. I believe it was around the midway point, maybe before or after the Holy Cross game. That's when they made all these defensive adjustments. And Devin Grant, as a result, really did not play corner for the rest of the season. Now, I should mention that if either of them at this point were still truly, really excellent corners, they would be playing corner because, after all, cornerback is a more valuable position than safety. That being said, having that position flexibility is really important, especially in football, because you just never know what could happen. Obviously, we don't wish injury, but injuries just happen at a more high or at a higher frequency in football than any other sport. You could have a game where you have multiple cornerbacks go down, and all of a sudden you need a guy like Devin Grant to play corner in an emergency, or Duce Chestnut to play corner in an emergency. That can happen, unfortunately, right? So it never hurts to have that position flexibility with Duce Chestnut and Devin Grant. So overall, when you look at Syracuse's strengths this upcoming season, I really like their quarterback room, no matter who it is at this point, between Steve Angeli and Rickie Collins, because if Rickie Collins wins the job, that means he's better than Steve Angeli, who seems like he could be pretty good. And if Steve Angeli wins the job, well, I think he's going to be pretty good anyway. The wide receiver room, yeah, it did lose Trevor Pena, and Jackson Meeks is in the NFL now, but I still think with Johntay Cook and Darrell Gill leading the charge, it can be a very capable unit. And then you look at the starting safeties for Syracuse this upcoming season. You got two of the three back. You got Devin Grant back. You got Duce Chestnut back. You can count on them being leaders for Syracuse on defense this upcoming season. What are your strengths for Syracuse football in 2025? Their roster-wise, I should say. Comment your thoughts in the comment section below. As far as what is coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future, I did mention very early on in the podcast that Syracuse still has a couple of scholarships remaining. So we'll talk about where Syracuse could still look to improve if they so choose for next season. We'll also discuss on Monday Syracuse football breakout candidates. And Tuesday, we'll go back to basketball, talking about Syracuse basketball breakout candidates. So all that and more coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future. And thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. Now, for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On Portal Show with football recruiting expert Brian Smith, who's got the latest rumors and signings each and every day. And you can be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to the college football landscape. I should also mention with Syracuse football recruiting that I believe they are down to a final six list with a four-star cornerback from Florida, CJ Hester. So hopefully Syracuse picks up some buzz to land him. Obviously, they are also firmly in the hunt for five-star wide receiver Calvin Russell out of Florida as well. And you can get updates on both of those guys on the Locked On Portal Show with Brian Smith. Now, you might be asking yourself, where can I find the Locked On Portal Show? Great question. You can find it on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button. If you really enjoy the podcast, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you could just do me a favor, since you really enjoy the podcast, just tell one or two of your closest Syracuse friends about the Locked On Syracuse podcast. It helps the channel grow and reach all Syracuse Orange fans. And of course, if you're already subscribed to the channel, thank you all so much. You all are truly the best. And I will see you all again soon.